it was nice.
Good job, Sarah.
Don't thank the drinking fountain.
I filtered that yourself? That's good.
Yeah.
Family recipe.
Okay, so if we could just start out by having you say your name and then spell it, please.
Okay. Leonard Peters, Leonard Peters.
Thank you. My name's Laura Arata. It's November 19th already, 2013. And we're conducting this interview on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. So I wonder if we could start, if you could tell us a little bit about how your family came to Hanford and where you were from.
I was born in Denver in August of 43. My father came out in June or July of 43 from Denver. And so my mom, myself, and my brother were there in Denver. And when I was 2 months old, we came out with another family, the Carl Eckert family. And it was my mom, Mrs. Eckert, their daughter, who was about my age, and my brother. So 5 of us came out in a car in October of 43. And my dad was working out here, and so that's how we came out, was in an old car.
And what was your father doing at Hanford?
He was a truck driver. He drove for Remington Arms in Denver, who was DuPont. And he also worked for Bechtel up in Alaska. And he came down, went back to Denver, was driving, heard about this place. And if you'd like a very interesting story, he was driving for a Army officer, a colonel or something, I'm not sure. Kind of a, I'll say chauffeur, but it wasn't really a chauffeur. But my dad had heard about this place, and he asked this, I'll say colonel, about it. And very few people knew about it. But this colonel says, well, I can't tell you anything about it, but if you've heard of heavy water, it has something to do with heavy water. Of course, my dad, heavy water, didn't mean anything to him. But, you know, hindsight, it's kind of interesting to me that this colonel knew a little bit about what was going on here. As big a secret as it was, not that many people knew, but he had some idea what was going on. Found that very interesting.
Yeah, and how long did your father work at the Hanford site?
From 43 until he retired in 73.
Okay, wonderful. We'll come back to that. I want to ask you just a few questions about the area. Obviously, you were very, very young.
I'm sorry, he passed away in 73. He retired in 67.
Okay. I'll have more questions for
Yeah.
you. Do you remember growing up what sort of housing you lived in, what the situation was like?
My first memory was an A house, 1520 Thayer. We moved in there about 1945. So that's my first memory, though we lived many places before that, as my dad's Q clearance bears out, but my memory goes back to the A house in 1945.
Did you live there for quite a while?
Lived there until around 56, 57.
And could you describe that house a little bit for anyone who doesn't know what an A house?
A house is a duplex, 2-story. You have neighbors literally right next door to you. It was a 3-bedroom, all upstairs. And of course back then there was no air conditioning, and it get hot in the summertime. I can literally remember summers 109 to 110, 12 degrees. And the only air conditioning was a swamp cooler. And so it was pretty miserable, but yet you didn't think about it because that's just the way it was. The government literally furnished everything, from throw rugs to table, chairs. I mean, literally everything. Coal, had a coal burning furnace. And like once a month or so on, they would deliver coal. And you had to make sure there was a coal bin that had slats in it. And you had to make sure that the slats were in, because if you forgot to put the slats in, you'd have literally coal all over the basement floor. And so that was kind of interesting. My dad every morning would have to get up and stoke the fire and get it going, in the wintertime, because we used to have some pretty bad winters compared to today. And so that was, again, just part of living in this area. Dust storms, you've heard of the termination winds. Literally the wind would blow and the curtains would go back and forth and just wave in the breeze with all the windows closed. And you'd have 1/4 of an inch of dust on the windowsills and everything. But, there again, that's the way it was. I can remember one story my wife tells it when her mother came out with her and her brother, met at the train station, and the father was there to pick them up. There was a windstorm right then. And her first words were, "Sherman, get me a ticket back home." And they ended up dying here and buried here. And I know my dad, he swore he wanted to go back to Colorado, but again, he was buried here and lived here all the rest of his life. But what I was going to say on the government, everything, I've heard of people, we never did do it, but people get tired of a chair or something, they'd break it, call housing, "Hey, we need another chair," and they'd come out and replace the chair. And if you had, back then they had fuses as opposed to breakers. Blow a fuse, call housing, it's an electrician out to change a fuse for you. I mean, it was pretty amazing, really. And it was good quality furniture.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about growing up in Richland in the 40s and 50s, sort of what the community was like at that time.
It was a fairly small town, of course, I think, and this is just my memory. There's about probably maybe 23,000 people is all, something like that. And it was truly a Leave It to Beaver era. People laugh at that, but that's exactly what it was, because you stop and think about it. In order to live in Richland, you had to work out in the area. In order to work out in the area, you need a clearance. And it was not unusual to have someone knock at the door and be an FBI agent investigating someone or something. I mean, it was very controlled. And so there was no crime to speak of, nickel-dime stuff, but there was one murder in all those years that they never did find the killer. But no, we'd play out all night, and folks wouldn't think a thing about it. That's just the way it was. And in the summertime, like I said, as hot as it was, all the windows and doors would be wide open and wouldn't think a thing about it. And, it's just, people kind of knew one another. Not that you knew everybody, but, that small a town and everyone working out there. And everyone rode the bus. So there was a camaraderie with not only where you work, but also on the buses. And people I think really did try and watch out for one another. But no, growing up, it was great. It was one kind of fun story that we used to hooky bob. You know what that is?
I don't.
Okay, what we'd do in the wintertime when the roads were snowy and icy, you'd hide behind a bush, and as a car went by, you ran out and grabbed the bumper and have them drag you around. And that was a lot of fun. That was one of the winter sports. But it was kind of interesting. I can remember newspaper front page, it showed a bus with a glove on it. And the story was a hooky bobber, and his hand was wet and it froze to the bumper. And make a long story short, it was on the dangers of hooky bobbing. And but it just happens that the guy that glove belonged to graduated a couple years ahead of me. His name was Jim Crum, who is now an attorney for the U.S. government. But no, it was a fun time. I mean, the Friday night shows literally was wall-to-wall kids. Very seldom was there a fight or anything, and you know, we'd hang out at the Spud Nut shop, or there was another place called Tim's. Someone that had a car would drive around the uptown area, I'll bet 30 times, just looking for gals or whatever. Just, I mean, it was American Graffiti time. I mean, have you seen American Graffiti?
Yes, sir.
You know, you see that, and every person in there, hey, that was so-and-so, that was so-and-so. I mean, it was so accurate to our high school days that it was a good time to grow up, because wintertime, of course, we had Christmas tree forts, and if there was snow on the ground, we'd have snow forts and choose up sides and have snowball fights hiding behind our snow forts. We would, if there was no snow, or even if there was snow after Christmas, we'd build Christmas tree forts, stack them up, and have a roof on it, and even sleep out in it. But if neighbor down the street, you know, if they had Christmas tree fort, about 1 or 2 in the morning, we'd sneak down and steal all their trees. And we'd have a bigger fort then. We would sleep out a lot in the summertime, because it was hot. But I can remember we would sleep out maybe 10 o'clock at night or so. There were still cherry orchards in town up on Van Giesen and things. We lived just around the corner on Thayer. We'd get up, go down there and steal cherries. We'd steal quite a few cherries. Then the next day we'd sell them house to house. What else was there? But the buses was a big part. Buses were fun because there was 2 groups. They were both run by the government, but there was what they called the city local, which took people from point A to point B, as far as downtown and uptown, different places. Then there was the outer area buses that took workers to work and brought them home. But there was 2 different, not bus companies, but groups of drivers that drove for each group. But not only hooky bobbing, but it was always fun to, as buses passed, you know, snowball them, throw snowballs at them, and, you know, it, just fun things.
Some good winter sports.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about these? You mentioned Friday night shows and also the Spud Nut
Oh,
Shop.
yeah.
Could you describe those a little bit?
It was, I mean, literally everyone went to them. All the kids went to them. And, you know, you're talking the 50s where rock and roll was just coming in. And I wrote a piece one time on, I really think that we were born at a nice time, because we can remember big bands, we can remember that type of music and how rock and roll came in. And, you know, how, of course, parents didn't like rock and roll at all. It was evil and all this. But a lot of the movies, some of the movies, had rock and roll stars. And, I can remember people dancing in the aisles while the movie was on, things like that. And I can remember one gal was dancing what they used to call a dirty bop. They ended up kicking her out. But no, there was dancing and hooting and hollering. And before the Uptown Theater opened was a Village Theater. And that was when we were younger, but that's when they showed the serials, whether it be Superman or Whip Wilson or whomever. But every Saturday we'd go to the show. There'd be a cartoon as well as one or two double feature. And, that's back, we were young, but fun thing then, I guess, was to have your popcorn boxes. They were boxes at the time. You'd flatten them and throw them and make a shadow on the screen. That was the big deal. But Village Theater was so strange because it was all kids, basically. Because the Richland Theater, which is now the Players, was more the adults. The Village Theater was for little kids. But you literally would walk down the aisles, and it was kind of carpeting, and you'd stick. I mean, I don't think they ever cleaned it. Pop spilled on it and candy and everything else. But, that was fun. Then they did build the Uptown Theater, and that was more adult movies. But on Friday nights it was a lot of science fiction. That's where you saw Frankenstein, Dracula, and Wolfman, and all that. Then the midnight shows, that was really neat. They'd have a midnight show. We wouldn't get home till 3 in the morning, but no big deal. You'd walk home. No big deal. I don't know if you'd do it today, but, there'd be half a dozen of your friends walking home with you and, just having a good time. But the Friday night shows, I started smoking quite early. I don't smoke now, but I can remember from mowing the lawn and peeling the taters, things like that, I get $1 a week allowance. And with that $1, I could buy a pack of cigarettes, which would last me a week, get into the show, and have like a dime left over. So, $1, that was in Fat City.
Do you remember how much a movie cost about that time?
First ones I can remember was 11 or 12 cents, and then it went to 20 cents. And I think during my high school days, if I remember right, it was probably 35 cents, something like that. I'm not sure.
Great. I'm fascinated by sort of the Spud Nut Shop and Tim's. Can you describe those a little bit?
Well, Tim's was where Dr. Shavala place is. It's kind of catty-cornered from the graveyard, the old graveyard. And it was a nice place, fireplace in it and everything. That's where the kids hung out. And it wasn't really a pizza parlor, but it was kind of a pizza parlor sandwich place. And it was our high school days, and it closed. I'm not sure exactly when, but became Enan's Funeral Home. Went from the restaurant to Enan's Funeral Home, and then Enan's, of course, moved out the bypass. But Spud Nut Shop, it's bigger now than it was. It used to just be just a few booths. But I can remember Spud Nuts were, I wouldn't say 10 cents. And for a Spud Nut Alamo, that was Spud Nut with soft ice cream on it. That was 15 cents. And if you had 15 cents for that, you was pretty good shape. Because, we didn't have money like that. And there's another place just 2 doors down from that was Fish and Chips. But it was interesting the way they spelled fission was fission. like nuclear. It was fission chips. You can see some old pictures of the Spud Nut shop, and in the just a couple doors down, you'll see this fission chips. But we'd hang out at the Spud Nut shop before the movie, and then maybe go there after the movie, and that's just where everyone hung out. When we had a car later, more in our high school years, we hung out at a place called Skip's. It was where Les Schwab is now. But there was that was kind of the hangout there. I don't know if you want this on there. It's not very nice, but Skip's, there was a young gal worked there with a cleft palate. And one of the guys that we kind of ran with, he had a cleft palate also. He was about 3 years older than me, but he pulled in there, him and friends, and she said in her cleft palate way, "May I help you?" He said, "Yeah, give me a such and such." And she got mad. "You don't have to make fun of me," because she thought just making fun of him. Kind of a sad story, but kind of humorous also. But no, there's just the movies was a big part of life. Of course, swimming. We used to swim in the Yakima a lot, and the old pool, what we used to call the big pool down in what's now Howard Amon Park. It used to be Riverside Park. And there's a swimming pool there. And the flood of 47, 48, it flooded the park, and so they done away with that pool and built the present one. But that flood was quite a deal. I can remember going, like, the bridge was out going out of Richland. They had a pontoon bridge, and that causeway wasn't there then. It was just flat. But I thought that was so neat. We was going across the bridge, and you see pontoons all the way across it with, lumber to drive on. And that always impressed me. That down around Gowan and things, I can remember the basement flooded from that flood, and it was quite a flood. That's when they built the dam or dike around Richland and Kennewick and so on. I was thinking something else and lost it. But no, the flood was quite an event. I worked with a guy named Ralph Schaefer who had private pilot's license. And they hired him as a bus driver, but they let him go from bus driving long enough because the only way to the airport at the time was to fly from Richland to Pasco. So they hired him to ferry people to the Pasco airport in his private plane. Because, there was no way out of Richland until they put that pontoon bridge in.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, obviously you went through school here. Do you have any memories? There were also some residents that were here prior to 1943 that were still in school here that were moved off sort of their family lands. Did you go to school with anybody who had kind of memories of that you recall?
Not to my knowledge. You hear all kinds of stories and things that I don't know. I know I've heard that one family, or some people, I'll say, when they were, quote, kicked out of White Bluff, Hanford area, they moved to Prosser or Sunnyside, somewhere up there, and swore they'd never set foot in Richland. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I know there's hard feelings over it, rightfully so. But no, I don't know of anyone. I know we had a lot of construction workers in trailer parks, and North Richland was a big trailer park, and they had a elementary school out there, John Ball. And once they got all the houses built that they were going to build, I guess, they closed the trailer park, closed John Ball, and had them all into town. And I can remember living on Thayer, going to school old Sacagawea, the old Sac, that for some reason for 2-3 days they sent me to Spalding. I had to walk to school, which was maybe 3-4 blocks, 5 blocks. I can remember big piles of dirt, having to climb over them to get to school, and the reason for that was they were building the ranch houses at that time. So I was probably first grade, I'm guessing. So they were still building in the late 40s, early 50s. In fact, Bower Days and the Richland Village came later, after the letter houses. But school, no, I honestly can't remember any, kids there.
No problem. We're here to get your memories.
Yeah.
So, a bunch of other things I want to ask you about. One thing, you said your father worked at Hanford until 67.
He retired.
He retired in 67. So he was working in the area when President Kennedy came in 1963. Do you have any memories of that event?
No, I was in the Navy then, so no. I know my wife said that she went out to see him, and there were so many people, you couldn't hardly see him, but she went out to it. But no, I got out of the Navy in October 63. I was on a train back to Denver to visit relatives. That's kind of sad. Sitting in the club car playing cards with strangers. And the porter came in, black fella. Says, the president's been shot. And we all, oh, come on, pulling our leg, he's joking. Then I says, you don't joke about something like that. And we were somewhere around Wyoming on a train, and then they was able to get a radio station over the PA or whatever it was. Sure enough, a little bit later that he'd died. And that's how I learned of it. And I'll never forget, that train ride, and got to Denver, and, it was just strange.
Of course. And we're right on the anniversary of
Yeah,
that now.
yeah. But my dad, I don't know if he went to see him or not. I mean, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. He came out of the Depression. He was born in '03, so he'd been through a lot. And I can remember him saying that he'd vote for a yellow dog before he'd vote for a Republican. I mean, he was the old Democrat, but he did vote for one Republican. That was John Dam, who was running for county commissioner. And they were personal friends. He says that's the only Republican he'd ever voted for.
One exception.
Yeah.
So did you work at Hanford at all? Is it just
Yeah.
you did? So could you
I
start filling us in on that a
I
little?
worked 40 years out there. Hired on 65. And luckily my dad was still working. So we overlapped. We were both drivers. And I started out as a labor, though they called them servicemen. It was basically a labor. Then I got set up to bus driver. And in 61, had a layoff. And I could have stayed. But I thought, let's see what else is out there. And I went to work for Battelle. And I was with Battelle for about 13 years in inhalation toxicology. Long-term study, plutonium, curium, americium studies on dogs. And in about 84, I quit Battelle and went back to transportation because money, let all your college folks know that biology's not real high paying unless you're a PhD or something. But BS in biology's not much. But no, I really enjoyed that. In fact, when McCluskey, when the glove box blew up out 200 areas, it's exposed to, I forget if it was curium or americium, but there hadn't been a lot of studies on those. And like I said, I was working in inhalation toxicology, and we got 2 or 3 big contracts right after that to study the health effects of curium americium through inhalation. And but he was an amazing man because, you know, I worked with PhDs, immunologists, veterinaries, hematologists, you name it. We had the discipline there, pathologists. And they didn't give him 6 months to live with what he got. He ended up living probably 20 years or better. I mean, it's quite an amazing story. You can go on the internet and look up Atomic Man, and his story's in there.
We actually interviewed the gentleman who was in charge of the cleanup, of cleaning up his hospital room.
Yeah. I don't know if it was this guy. I worked with what we called radiation monitor. Now they're HPTs or something, but he was with him scrubbing him and things. His name was Larry Belt. It'd be a good interview for you. But I worked with Larry for a number of years. He was our radiation monitor when we exposed dogs and so on. But he said, you can't believe the pain this man was in. He said we had to literally scrub him with brushes because he had stuff embedded in him, in his face and so on. And I mean, it's terrible. He says, we'd submerge him and scrub him. And no, Larry Belt tells some stories about it. But back to my job, I quit Battelle for financial reasons and went back driving, drove bus for a lot of years. They shut the bus system down, and so I went to work driving truck and drove Erdif trucks hauling the solid waste from out around the river and so on. Did that for a number of years, and then retired. I taught hazmat classes for the last about 10 years. But buses was a fun job. We a lot of stories there. One of our drivers, named Carol Agcock, was driving down Delafield, taking day shift home, so it was about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And a little girl standing out in the middle of the street playing, about 5, 6 years old. Stopped his bus, pulled the brake, got out and spanked her butt. You know, get out of here. Got back in the bus, and the passengers were just, what are you doing? You could get in trouble for that. And it was his daughter. But no, we've had people have epileptic seizures on the bus, and you know, just all sorts of things like that. A lot of stories.
You must see a little bit of everything.
Oh yeah, we had literally poker games, bridge games on the buses. They had cardboard tables. 4 people would sit down, put their table between the aisles and play cards, and had a bridge game going from 100F, which was where the animals were before they built 300, the animal life science at 300 area. But they had a bridge game that was going steady for at least 30, 35 years. I mean, it was different people. You know, some would retire, someone else would take their place. But it started out at 100F at lunch break and then on the bus, and it continued. When we were at 300, they were still playing. You know, again, it was different players, but it was the same game.
Wow. Oh, there was something I wanted to ask you about. Returning back to when you worked at in inhalation toxicology with Battelle, So did you work with the smoking beagles?
Yes. That was my first job, was smoking.
We just interviewed Vanis Daniels.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I
Last
know
week
Vanis.
we worked with the smoking beagles. Could you describe for us the process of getting the beagles to smoke 2 packs a day?
The hard part's lighting them. No, it was, reason for the study, as I understood it, was uranium miners were dying early. And they want to know why. Because it could be cigarette smoke, because most of them were smokers, uranium ore dust, or it could be radon daughters. And so we had a group of, I forget now, 70 dogs, 60, something like that. And 10 of them would receive smoke only, cigarette smoke only, at a table, kind of a horseshoe, and a mask that fit over their muzzle, and cigarette in there. And like every 7th or 10th breath, a little gadget would open, and their breath would suck in the smoke. But then 10 of them would receive uranium ore dust and radon daughters. There's a large chamber that would hold 10 dogs around it. And up in the top there was a grinder thing that would grind the ore dust and sprinkle it down in. I mean, it wasn't noticeable, it wasn't thick, but it was in there. And then we had radon that, I think it was water bubbled through it that would give the radon gas, and it would get into the chamber. And then we had another 10 that would receive cigarette and the radon. And then a control group that didn't receive anything. They were called sham. You'd bring them in, go through all the same routine, but they wouldn't receive anything. And just see what the effects were. And it was a lifespan study. So you'd look at the dosage and how long they lived and what affected them the most. So that's basically what it was one story I heard, and probably true, was that the Russians said that our limits were too high, that, should be lower. So that maybe prompted it, I don't know. But then after that, when we got to 300 area, 100F moved into 300 area, and they closed 100F down. And then they had a group of just smoking dogs. And it was more difficult in the sense that we had a mask that fit over their muzzle, and they could trick it. They could breathe out the side of their mouth, or, they could, well, when they did it at one area, they traked them. And there was no cheating that. I mean, it was direct. There was no getting around that. But no, I learned a lot. I mean, that was one of the most exciting jobs, and the learning curve was just like that. I mean, really learned a lot about physiology and biology and chemistry, and you work there that long and you learn a lot, because part of my job was necropsying, or what they call autopsying, but necropsying the dogs. And we always said we took everything but the bark. I mean, we literally disarticulated them and took every piece that they had, every organ, every bone, separated it. Because the reason for that, we want to know where the plutonium or curium or whatever went to in the body. Where was the body burden? Was it in the lungs? Was it in the bones? And interesting enough, we exposed to Pu-238 and 239, and the 238 would be a bone seeker. The bones would have high doses, but in 239 the bones hardly got anything. It was all soft tissue. So they learned a lot from that, as far as where these elements, what they seek, the target organs, if you will. I don't know if all that should go in the.
Fascinating. We love hearing about it. Could you talk a little bit about, obviously, during this time, security and secrecy was still very much a part of working at Hanford. Did that
Yeah.
impact your work at all?
Oh, a lot. You know, being raised from my oldest memories, it was secure. And I can remember when I was probably about 10, 11, 12 years old, I went in for a library card here in Richland. They asked who my dad worked for. I was scared to tell them because of security. My dad never told me what went on out there. And I knew security was a big deal. And I says, I don't know. I kind of knew, but and says, well, what does he do? And I says, well, he drives. And so then she wrote down General Electric. But no, I mean, it was paramount, even as a kid. I can remember, in this kind of funny hindsight, but kind of put yourself in that time frame. I can remember calling my brother, who was 7, 8, 9 years old, would have been in the early 50s, McCarthy era. I can remember calling my brother a dirty communist. My dad just came unglued. I mean, he'd rather had me call him SOB than that because, you know, that wasn't something you messed with in the early 50s and with the FBI and everything else. But, I mean, security, I mean, it was bred into you, I guess. And when I hired on, it was still, but not like it was. But, you know, many of us still had that same mentality. And I can remember when they started releasing things to the public. You know, that always bothered me because, you know, this is secure. And people don't have the need to know a lot of this stuff. But, no, security was a big deal. I mean, you didn't go any place without a security badge. And, you know, they could stop you, search your car, and everything else. So it was a high priority when you know, there was seclusion areas within the area. You know, you might get out the area, but you might not be able to get into a certain area. And you got in that area, you couldn't get into another area like Dash 5, Z-Plant, or Radox, or Purex. You needed extra security on your badge to get in these places. So security was very tough.
Could you talk a little bit about how Hanford was overall as a place to work? Anything you found particularly challenging or very rewarding about your time in the area?
I think it was great. You know, let's face it, it was great for a lot of people that worked here. I mean, you know, good pay, relatively good pay, and a lot of people raised their families and sent them to school on this pay out here. And as far as working out there, I mean, we really had fun in the early days. By the early days, I mean, when I hired on, because I felt very lucky that when I hired on, most of the old-timers were still working. You know, by old-timers, I mean them that hired in the 40s. So, you know, a lot of the stories, a lot of things that they knew that, and interesting things that they talked about, you know, I was privy to, and that was great. And it was, to me, really a fun place to work. I really enjoyed it. Later, you know, I can remember saying more than once in the 80s or 90s, you know, this isn't fun like it used to be. And it wasn't. But, you know, I was younger then, and that made a difference. I was about 21, 22 when I hired on. And so, you know, times changed. I think In the early days, my early days, there was what we'd call maybe some dead wood, and they might have 5 people to do a job for 2 people. But I mean, it was good. It was job security. Well, then came the cuts and so on, and so I think that made it a little different because one thing that's bothered me over the years, there's been layoffs, but you can check the records many times after these layoffs, within 6 months, are calling them back because work has to be done. We might cut 500 people, but that job is still there. So they call a portion of them back, which to me doesn't make sense. But, I don't think there's the fat out there that there was at one time.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about? Any other stories or things that stand out?
No, I think the racial thing was a big story, in the early days because there wasn't that many black people working out there. And I can remember, as mentioned earlier, that Richland didn't have hardly any blacks. We had one black I'm aware of. He was a shoeshine guy at the Gansel's barber shop. His picture's still in there. But I can remember, I must have been 6, 7 years old. I saw my first black person. I was in a car downtown with my mom, and I saw him, and I just saw his hands and face. But I can remember wondering, I wonder if his whole body is that way, because we just didn't see him. We had 2 black guys at high school, C-Dub and Norris Brown, who were terrific basketball players. And main reason their family moved was because of those 2 boys. And it was a different time then. I don't know if this should go on record because I don't know if it's true or not. But talking about the early people that worked there, one of the stories that I heard, like I say, whether it's true, I have no idea, but they were out working, and they had a burn barrel that's very cold, a barrel full of wood and so on, burn barrel. Construction workers were huddled around it, and this one colored individual just kind of bulled his way in. He wouldn't get up the front. And the story goes, whether again true or not, I don't know. A carpenter took his hammer and ended it. And that wouldn't surprise me, though I don't know if it's true or not, because there was prejudice. A lot of the people that came here was from the South. And it was a different lifestyle. I know that they had separate camps for the blacks and the whites. And, it was segregated. So, I can remember when I was driving bus here, we only had, to my recollection, only one black in all of transportation. There may have been more, but I think only one. And it wasn't until probably 63 or 4 that they really started, quote, recruiting blacks.
If I understand, there were labor organizers and people who came in within the NAACP and that sort of thing to sort of assess conditions, which would have been about the time you were working in 100 and 300 areas.
Yeah.
Do you have any recollections of that?
Well, the one black that I told you about was serviceman, labor, same group I was in. And he was the head of the local NAACP. His name